Elvis Presley lived a life so big it created its own gravity. It pulled people, stories, and myths into its orbit. We know he met the Beatles. We know he met President Nixon. Those stories are confirmed, photographed, and part of history. But what about the stories that live in the shadows? The whispers of encounters that were never photographed, never confirmed, but never quite went away either. These are the ghosts in the Graceland archives. Did the king of rock and roll really have a secret late-night phone call with the most famous blonde in Hollywood? Did he turn down a song from a young, ambitious David Bowie? Did he come terrifyingly close to meeting one of America's most infamous killers? These stories are more than just trivia. They are puzzle pieces from a life we thought we knew. They tell us something about fame, about isolation, and about the strange connections that happen, or almost happen, behind the velvet ropes. Why do these specific tales persist when so many others have faded? And what does it say about us that we so desperately want them to be true? Number 16. Could the king of rock and roll have crossed paths with a cult leader? The late 1960s in Los Angeles was a strange time. The sunshine and optimism of the early decade were curdling. The air was thick with smoke, music, and a sense of impending change, not all of it good. In one part of this world was Elvis Presley. He was finishing up a long, frustrating contract with Hollywood movie studios. He was living in Bel Air, preparing for a comeback that would redefine his career in Las Vegas. He was a symbol of an older, more innocent America. He was the establishment. In another part of this same world, a failed musician with wild eyes was gathering a following. His name was Charles Manson. He was the counterculture's dark shadow. He represented the chaos that was bubbling just beneath the surface. The rumor is simple and chilling. It suggests that Manson, in his desperate quest for a record deal, tried to make contact with Elvis Presley. The details vary depending on who is telling the story. One version claims Manson showed up at one of Elvis's Los Angeles homes hoping to give him a demo tape or a song. Another version suggests a more indirect connection. Manson had famously connected with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. He also had a tense relationship with record producer Terry Melcher, the son of Doris Day. The LA music scene, for all its size, was a small, interconnected world. The idea is that Manson, through these connections, attempted to get his music into the hands of the biggest star on the planet. To understand the plausibility, you have to look at the timelines and the people involved. In 1968, Elvis was living at 1174 Hillcrest Road in Beverly Hills. This was the same year that Manson and his family were becoming deeply involved with Dennis Wilson, even living at his home for a period. Manson was obsessed with getting a record deal. He saw himself as a musical messiah and believed his songs held secret messages, a belief that would later mutate into his twisted helter-skelter philosophy. He desperately needed the validation of the music industry, and who was a bigger symbol of that industry than Elvis Presley? However, there is no credible evidence from anyone inside Elvis's world that this. The Memphis Mafia, Elvis's loyal group of friends and bodyguards, were a human fortress. Getting to Elvis was nearly impossible. Men like Joe Esposito and Jerry Schilling managed his daily life with military precision. A character like Charles Manson would have set off every alarm bell. In his exhaustive two-volume biography of Elvis, Last Train to Memphis and Careless Love, author Peter Guralnick makes no mention of any such event. Guralnick had access to almost everyone who was in Elvis's inner circle. If a story this dramatic had any truth to it, it likely would have surfaced in his research. So why does the story persist? It's because it represents a powerful collision of two American archetypes, where Elvis was the American dream, a poor boy who became a king. Manson was the American nightmare, a charismatic monster who twisted love into hate and music into a call for murder. The idea that these two forces, the light and the dark of the 1960s, could have nearly touched is a piece of modern folklore too potent to dismiss. The Tate LaBianca murders in August 1969, which took place in the former home of Terry Melcher, sent a shockwave of fear through Hollywood. It shattered the illusion of safety for the rich and famous. Elvis himself was deeply disturbed by the killings. He increased his personal security and became even more isolated. The story of a near miss with Manson feeds into this narrative of Elvis's growing paranoia and his retreat from a world he no longer understood. What if the gate guard who might have turned Manson away had been new on the job? What if a demo tape had somehow slipped through the cracks and ended up in a pile of fan mail? If Elvis had heard Manson's music, what would he have thought of its strange folky darkness? And perhaps the most chilling question, does the simple fact that these two men operated in the same city at the same time tell us everything we need to know about the thin line between fame and infamy? Number 15. Did two American icons share a secret phone call? Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley were twin stars in the firmament of 20th century fame. Both were impossibly beautiful. Both became symbols of sexuality and rebellion in their respective eras. Both came from humble beginnings and were thrust into a world of unimaginable pressure. And both died tragically young, leaving behind legacies that have only grown with time. It seems almost inevitable that their paths would have crossed. The world wanted them to be together. A meeting between the two of them would have been like a collision of suns. The most persistent story is not one of a grand love affair, but of a single, unconfirmed moment of connection. According to some accounts, a meeting was once arranged by a Hollywood studio. This would have been around 1960, when Elvis was returning from the army and Monroe was one of the biggest, if most troubled, stars in the world. The story goes that Elvis, for reasons unknown, turned the meeting down. He was either too shy, too intimidated, or perhaps simply not interested. But another, more intimate version of the story has survived. This version claims that Marilyn Monroe once called Elvis late at night. They spoke on the phone, two lonely icons sharing a moment of quiet understanding in the middle of the night. This rumor gained some traction from Byron Raphael, a former Hollywood agent who claimed he was there when the studio tried to set up a date in 1960. In interviews given decades later, he said Elvis was hesitant and declined. But the phone call story is much harder to pin down. It exists in the realm of hearsay, passed down through second and third-hand accounts. There are no phone records, there are no witnesses from Elvis's inner circle who have ever spoken about it. Joe Esposito, one of Elvis's closest confidants, stated in his book Good Rockin' Tonight that Elvis admired Marilyn, but to his knowledge, they never met or spoke. The timeline makes a meeting plausible but complicated. In the mid-1950s, when Elvis exploded onto the scene, Marilyn was already a global superstar. They were both at the top of their respective games, but their worlds were different. Elvis was a touring musician, Marilyn was a movie star bound to studio schedules. By the time Elvis went to Hollywood full-time in the early 1960s, Marilyn's life was becoming increasingly chaotic due to personal struggles and her reliance on prescription drugs. She died in August 1962. Elvis was filming Girls, Girls, Girls at the time. He was reportedly saddened by her death, as was the rest of the world. He understood the crushing weight of that level of fame better than almost anyone. The endurance of this rumor has less to do with facts and more to do with cultural desire. We want them to have met. Their stories are so similar in their broad strokes. Both were managed and controlled by powerful men, Colonel Tom Parker for Elvis and various studio heads for Marilyn. Both struggled to be taken seriously as artists. Elvis wanted to be a great dramatic actor. Marilyn wanted to be respected for more than just her looks. They were both trapped inside their own images. A phone call between them feels poetically right. It's a scene from a movie that was never made. It's a moment of quiet solidarity between the two most famous, lonely people in the world. Even if they never spoke, the connection exists in our collective imagination. They are forever linked as the king and queen of a certain kind of American mythology. But what would they have said to each other on that supposed phone call? Would they have talked about the pressure, the lack of privacy, the feeling of being a product? Was the phone call a myth created simply because the reality of them never meeting was too disappointing to accept? And what does it say about the nature of celebrity that two of the most desired people on earth might have been too isolated to even connect for a single conversation? Number 14 was the King of Rock, offered a song by the Starman. By the early 1970s, the musical landscape had changed dramatically. The rock and roll Elvis had pioneered was now just one part of a much wider, wilder world. A new generation of artists was pushing boundaries with glam rock, prog rock, and heavy metal. One of the most innovative of these artists was David Bowie. He's a musical chameleon, constantly changing his look, his sound, and his persona. In 1972, he was Ziggy Stardust, a bisexual alien rock star. At the same time, Elvis Presley was the king of Las Vegas, performing sold-out shows in a white jumpsuit. They seem to exist in different universes, yet there is a persistent story that connects these two titans. The story goes that David Bowie, a longtime admirer of Elvis, wrote the song Golden Years specifically for him. He hoped Elvis would record it for his 1976 album, Station to Station. Bowie was in Los Angeles at the time, deep in a period of creative intensity and personal turmoil. Elvis was recording at Graceland's Jungle Room, and at RCA's Studio C in Hollywood. The idea was to send the song to Elvis, hoping the king would recognize its potential and give it his signature touch. This story comes directly from Bowie himself, which gives it more weight than many other unconfirmed encounters. In interviews, Bowie recounted how he had written the song with Elvis in mind. He said he was absolutely floored by Elvis, and that they had the same birthday, January 8th, which he felt was a significant connection. He loved Elvis's voice and thought the soulful, funky vibe of Golden Years would be a perfect fit. According to Bowie, the song was offered to Elvis's management, but they politely declined. The reason given was that Elvis was generally not accepting outside material unless it came from his established circle of songwriters. Looking at the context of the time, the rejection makes sense. By 1976, Elvis was in a state of physical and creative decline. His health was failing, and his motivation was low. Colonel Tom Parker maintained a tight grip on every aspect of his career, including song selection. The publishing rights were a major issue. The Colonel typically demanded a significant share of the publishing for any song Elvis recorded. This was a deal-breaker for many independent songwriters, including major artists like Bowie. It's highly unlikely that Bowie's team would have agreed to give up a portion of the rights to one of his songs. The what-if scenario is tantalizing. Golden Years is a fantastic song, a unique blend of funk, soul, and rock. It's easy to imagine Elvis's powerful baritone rapping around the lyrics. A collaboration, even an indirect one, between Bowie and Elvis would have been a landmark cultural event. It would have connected the original rebel of the 1950s with one of the leading innovators of the 1970s. It might have even given Elvis a much-needed creative jolt, pushing him in a more modern, relevant direction, much like his 1968 comeback had. But it was not to be. Bowie recorded the song himself, and it became a top 10 hit in both the US and the UK. The story highlights the creative prison Elvis found himself in during his final years. He was surrounded by people who were more interested in maintaining the status quo and the flow of money than in challenging him artistically. He had once been a musical revolutionary, but now he was an institution, and institutions are resistant to change. The offer from Bowie was a bridge to a new world that Elvis was ultimately unable to cross. Did Elvis himself ever actually hear the song? Was the offer rejected by the Colonel or his staff before it even reached Elvis's ears? If Elvis had heard it, would he have fought to record it, seeing it as a chance to connect with a new generation? And how different might the last year of Elvis's life have been if he had embraced the future of music instead of retreating into the past? Number 13. Did the gods of rock snub the king? In 1974, Led Zeppelin was arguably the biggest band in the world. They were the hammer of the gods, playing to sold-out stadiums and defining the sound of 1970s hard rock. Their concerts were legendary for their length, volume, and raw power. Elvis Presley, at the same time, was the undisputed king of Las Vegas. His shows were slick, professional, and powerful in a different way. He was a living legend, the man who had started it all. Both acts were at the top of their game, but they represented two very different eras of rock and roll. The story of their encounter is one of the most famous in rock lore, and it revolves around a meeting that was more of a near miss. Led Zeppelin, particularly Robert Plant and Jimmy Page, were huge fans of early Elvis. They revered the raw, rebellious energy of his Sun Records recordings. While on tour in the US, they made it a point to see Elvis perform in Las Vegas. After the show, an invitation was extended for the band to meet the king backstage. This is where the story gets murky. According to some versions, the meeting was awkward and brief. Elvis was polite but distant. He didn't seem to know who they were. According to other, more dramatic versions, the meeting was a disaster. The story often told is that Elvis was surrounded by police badges and guns talking about law enforcement. Robert Plant, a rock and roll frontman in the classic rebellious mold, supposedly grew uncomfortable. He made a cheeky comment, something along the lines of, "I see you're into collecting police stuff, Elvis. Well, I collect Holiday Inn keys." The implication was that Elvis was part of the establishment, while Zeppelin was still living the wild life on the road. The comment allegedly soured the mood, and the meeting ended abruptly. However, there is another, more substantiated account that suggests a proper meeting never even happened. It's Jerry Schilling, a close friend of Elvis and a key member of his entourage, tells a different story in his book Me and a Guy Named Elvis. Schilling confirms that Led Zeppelin came to the show, and that Elvis was aware they were in the audience. After the show, Elvis was tired and not in the mood for visitors. He sent Schilling out to greet the band and apologize on his behalf. According to Schilling, he spent some time with the band, who were gracious and understanding. They exchanged pleasantries, and that was it. No awkward meeting, no snide remarks, just a missed connection. So, which story is true? The tale of the awkward confrontation is certainly more exciting. It pits the old guard against the new guard in a clash of egos. It plays into the image of Led Zeppelin as irreverent rock gods and the late period Elvis as a man increasingly detached from the rock and roll world he helped create. The story has been repeated so often in books like Stephen Davis's Hammer of the Gods that it has taken on the weight of fact for many fans. But the account from Jerry Schilling, who was actually there, presents a much more mundane and believable scenario. The truth is likely somewhere in between the legend and the simple apology. It's possible members of the band did briefly meet Elvis on one of their many trips to see him. It's also possible that memories have been embellished over the years. What is certain is the mutual respect. Robert Plant has spoken many times about his love for early Elvis, and Elvis, for his part, was aware of the new wave of rock bands. He even performed a powerful version of Whole Lotta Shakin' Goin' On, a song from the same era as his own early hits, which Zeppelin sometimes incorporated into their live shows. Why was the story of a confrontation so quick to catch on? Did it represent a symbolic passing of the torch that never actually happened? If they had truly sat down and talked, what would a serious conversation between Robert Plant and Elvis Presley have sounded like? Could the man who sang Heartbreak Hotel find common ground with the men who created Stairway to Heaven? Or were their worlds, by 1974, simply too far apart to bridge? Number 12, Did the King Meet the Lizard King? The Doors and Elvis Presley both had a profound impact on music, but they came from different worlds. Elvis was the raw, physical energy of the 1950s. Jim Morrison was the dark, psychedelic poet of the late 1960s. Elvis's rebellion was in the swivel of his hips. Morrison's was in the depths of his lyrics about death, sex, and the subconscious. Yet, they shared some common ground. Both were charismatic frontmen. Both pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable on stage. And both became symbols of their respective generations. A rumored meeting between these two figures is a cornerstone of rock mythology. The story takes place in Las Vegas in the late 1960s. The Doors were in town to perform, and Elvis was in the early stages of his Las Vegas residency at the International Hotel. The legend says that Jim Morrison, perhaps in a state of altered consciousness, decided he wanted to meet the king. He made his way to the International, somehow got backstage, and had a brief, strange encounter with Elvis. The details of this supposed meeting are vague and dreamlike. There is no single authoritative account. It's a story pieced together from whispers. Some versions say Elvis was amused by Morrison. Others claim he was put off by Morrison's intensity and erratic behavior. One popular version of the tale has Morrison trying to talk to Elvis about poetry and shamanism, topics far removed from Elvis's usual backstage chatter about karate and numerology. The meeting, if it happened at all, was likely short and confusing for both parties. There is no photographic evidence, and no one from Elvis's inner circle has ever confirmed it. The members of the Memphis Mafia were fiercely protective of Elvis, especially from unpredictable characters like Morrison. It's hard to imagine them allowing him anywhere near Elvis. However, the Doors keyboardist, Ray Manzarek, did tell a story that lends a sliver of credibility to the idea. Manzarek said that the Doors producer Paul Rothchild had worked with Elvis. Rothchild supposedly arranged for the band to meet Elvis backstage. According to Manzarek, the meeting did happen, but it was Morrison who was unimpressed, viewing Elvis as part of the showbiz establishment he despised. This version is also unverified. It's possible Manzarek was repeating a story he'd heard, or that memory had blurred over time. What is more certain is the influence Elvis had on Morrison. As a teenager, Morrison was a huge Elvis fan. He saw the rebellious power in Elvis's early performances. In many ways, Morrison took the sexual energy that Elvis unleashed and pushed it into darker, more explicit territory. On stage, Morrison's hypnotic, sometimes confrontational presence was an evolution of the danger that Elvis had first brought to popular music. The story of their meeting, true or not, is compelling because it connects the beginning of the rock and roll rebellion with its chaotic, psychedelic peak. It's a meeting between the artist who broke down the door and the artist who ran screaming through it. Elvis opened up a space for performers to be sexual and dangerous. Morrison took that space and filled it with poetry, psychedelics, and a fascination with the abyss. What would a lucid, coherent conversation between these two men have been like? Could Elvis have seen a reflection of his younger, more dangerous self in Morrison? Did Morrison secretly crave the level of adoration Elvis commanded, even as he publicly rejected it? Or is the story simply a fan's fantasy, a desire to place two of rock's most iconic and self-destructive figures in the same room, just to see what would happen? Number 11. Was there a deeper conversation beyond the photo op? The story of Elvis Presley meeting Muhammad Ali is unique on this list because we know for a fact they met. There are famous photographs to prove it. The pictures were taken on February 14th, 1973. And Ali was in Las Vegas training for a fight. Elvis was performing at the Hilton. Ali visited Elvis backstage, and Elvis presented him with a custom-made robe. The robe was white, adorned with jewels, and had the words "The People's Champion" emblazoned on the back. The photos show two of the most famous men in the world, smiling, laughing, and playfully shadowboxing. It's a beautiful, iconic moment, but the unconfirmed part of this story is not about the meeting itself, but about what was said. The official account is that it was a brief, friendly exchange, mostly for the cameras. But some whispers suggest there was more to it. The rumor is that after the photos were taken, the two men had a private, more serious conversation. They were, in many ways, mirror images of each other. Both were born in the segregated South. Both used their extraordinary physical talents to achieve global fame. Both were controversial figures who challenged the establishment in their own ways. What could they have talked about? The theory is that they discussed the pressures of being a global icon. Ali had faced immense public backlash for his conversion to Islam and his refusal to be drafted into the Vietnam War. He had been stripped of his heavyweight title and banned from boxing for 3 years. He was a deeply political and spiritual man who had sacrificed everything for his principles. Where Elvis, on the other hand, had served in the army, he largely avoided political statements. His rebellion was cultural, not political, but he understood the isolation of fame. He knew what it was like to have every move scrutinized. This unconfirmed conversation would have been a meeting of two different kinds of kings. Ali was a king who fought the system from the outside. Elvis was a king who was, in many ways, a willing prisoner of the system. According to those who believe a deeper talk occurred, they might have found common ground in their shared spirituality. Ali's faith was the foundation of his life. Elvis, too, was a deeply spiritual man, constantly searching for answers in religious texts, from the Bible to the Book of the Dead. He was fascinated by faith and the afterlife. The source for this deeper conversation is tenuous. It comes from third-hand accounts and speculation. There's no direct testimony from anyone who was in the room. But the idea is powerful. The photographs show the public personas. The rumored conversation hints at the private men behind the images. Gene Kilroy, Ali's business manager, was present for the meeting and has spoken about the immense mutual respect between the two men. He described the atmosphere as warm and genuine, not just a stage publicity event. The story of the deeper conversation persists because the public meeting feels incomplete. It's almost impossible to believe that these two intelligent, charismatic men who had so much in common would have limited their interaction to a few pleasantries for the camera. We want to believe they connected on a human level, that they recognized the shared burden of their crowns. Did they discuss the cost of being the greatest and the king? Did Ali try to share his faith with Elvis, or did Elvis share his own spiritual searching with Ali? Could a longer conversation with a man of Ali's conviction and strength have had an impact on Elvis in his later, more troubled years? Or are we simply projecting our own desire for depth onto a simple, friendly photo opportunity between two legends? Number 10. Did two rebels without a cause almost cross paths? And James Dean and Elvis Presley are two of the most enduring symbols of 1950s rebellion. Dean, with his brooding intensity in films like Rebel Without a Cause, defined a new kind of vulnerable, misunderstood masculinity. Elvis, with his sneer and his swiveling hips, brought a dangerous sexual energy to popular music. Both became idols for a generation of teenagers who felt that no one understood them. But James Dean died in a car crash on September 30th, 1955, just as his star was reaching its zenith. Less than a year later, Elvis Presley was the most famous person in the world. They were comets passing in the night. Their periods of peak fame barely overlapped. But there is a persistent rumor that they did meet, however briefly. The story is usually set in Hollywood in 1955. Elvis was not yet a household name nationally, but his early Sun records were making waves. He was ambitious and looking towards a future that might include movies. James Dean was the talk of Hollywood, a brilliant but difficult young actor. The rumored encounter would have been a fleeting one, perhaps at a party, a diner, or on a studio lot. One of the most specific versions of this story comes from a mutual acquaintance, the actress Natalie Wood. She was Dean's co-star in Rebel Without a Cause and later became a friend of Elvis. According to some reports, Wood claimed to have introduced the two men. However, there is no solid verification of this. It remains in the realm of Hollywood legend. Another version of the story suggests they met through director Nicholas Ray, who directed Dean in his most famous film. Ray was known for his interest in youth culture and might have seen a kindred spirit in the young Elvis. The timeline is incredibly tight. Elvis's first national hit, Heartbreak Hotel, was released in January 1956, 4 months after Dean's death. Before that, Elvis's fame was largely regional, centered in the South. He made a few trips to Hollywood in 1955 for screen tests, but he was not yet the star he would become. It is during one of these brief trips that a meeting could have conceivably occurred. They moved in different circles, but Hollywood can be a small town. The plausibility is low, but not zero. Actor Dennis Hopper, a close friend of Dean's, was also an Elvis fan and saw him perform early on. The worlds of young actors and up-and-coming musicians did sometimes intersect. What makes the story so powerful is not the evidence, but the symbolism. Dean and Elvis were two sides of the same coin of rebellion. Dean's rebellion was internal, quiet, and filled with angst. Elvis's rebellion was external, loud, and joyful. After Dean's death, a vacuum was created. Hollywood and the youth market needed a new rebel. Elvis, with his raw talent and good looks, was perfectly positioned to fill that role. When Elvis made his first movie, Love Me Tender, in 1956, he was inevitably compared to James Dean. He was even considered for roles that might have gone to Dean had he lived. Then Elvis admired Dean as an actor. He reportedly watched Rebel Without a Cause multiple times, studying Dean's performance. He saw in Dean a seriousness and artistic depth that he aspired to in his own acting career. Even if they never shook hands, James Dean had a profound impact on Elvis Presley. He represented a type of artistic legitimacy that Elvis craved but was often denied by his handlers, who preferred to keep him in safe, formulaic musical comedies. The rumored meeting serves as a what-if moment. What if Dean had lived? Would they have become friends? The rivals, could Dean have advised Elvis on how to navigate the treacherous waters of Hollywood? Did Natalie Wood ever actually try to introduce them, or is that a story that grew over time? If they did meet for a fleeting moment, did they recognize the similar fire in each other's eyes? Or is the story of their meeting just a myth created to retroactively link the two greatest rebels of their generation, a way of making their connected legacies feel more tangible and complete? Number 9. What if the king had met his jester? Here, Frank Zappa was one of music's true originals. He was a brilliant composer, a virtuosic guitarist, a sharp social satirist, and a relentless critic of conformity. His music was a complex, often bizarre mixture of rock, jazz, classical, and comedy. He delighted in skewering everything from hippie culture to mainstream politics. Elvis Presley, especially in his later years, represented the mainstream that Zappa so often targeted. Elvis was show business, he was Las Vegas, he was a symbol of corporate rock. On the surface, it's hard to imagine two artists who were more different, and yet a strange story circulates about a potential meeting between them. The story is not about a friendly chat, but about a project. In the early 1970s, Zappa was reportedly approached with an idea to produce an album for Elvis Presley. The idea seems almost insane. Zappa's complex arrangements and satirical lyrics were the antithesis of Elvis's straightforward rock, pop, and gospel material. The image of Frank Zappa in a recording studio trying to direct Elvis Presley is the stuff of absurdist theater. The source of this rumor is a bit hazy, but it has been mentioned in various Zappa-related forums and biographies over the years. The story goes that a record executive, perhaps seeing Elvis's creative stagnation and Zappa's undeniable genius, thought that putting them together could create something explosive and new. It was a high-risk, high-reward idea. Zappa was known for being a demanding and uncompromising bandleader. Elvis was used to being the undisputed boss in the studio, surrounded by musicians who would follow his lead without question. A collaboration would have been a massive clash of wills. It's highly unlikely the proposal ever got close to Elvis himself. It was probably floated at a low level within the RCA Records or Colonel Parker's organization and quickly dismissed as being too radical. The Colonel's business model for Elvis was based on a proven formula. He was not interested in artistic experiments that might not sell. And from Elvis's perspective, he had little reason to work with a producer like Zappa. He was comfortable with his session players in Nashville and Hollywood, and with his longtime producer, Felton Jarvis. But the what if is fascinating. What kind of album would have resulted? Would Zappa have written new material for Elvis? Perhaps a satirical song about being the king, or a complex rock opera about a lonely superstar in a gilded cage? Would he have pushed Elvis vocally, getting him to try new phrasing and harmonies? It could have been a spectacular disaster, or it could have been a masterpiece, an album that critics would still be analyzing decades later. It might have been Elvis's version of Bob Dylan's John Wesley Harding, a strange, unexpected, artistic statement from a major star. The story persists because it represents the ultimate collision of the pop mainstream and the avant-garde underground. It's a fantasy booking for music nerds. It highlights the missed opportunities of Elvis's later career. He had one of the greatest voices of the 20th century, but by the mid-1970s, he was often given mediocre material to sing. A producer like Zappa would have challenged him in ways he hadn't been challenged since his early days at Sun Records with Sam Phillips. Did this offer ever actually get made, even at a low level, or is it just a piece of fan-generated fiction? If the offer had, by some miracle, reached Elvis, would his musical curiosity have outweighed his caution? Could Elvis have handled Zappa's notoriously difficult music and studio methods? And what would Frank Zappa, the ultimate anti-establishment artist, have truly thought of Elvis Presley, the ultimate establishment icon, face to face? Number 8. Could the godfather of method acting have mentored the king? When Elvis Presley went to Hollywood, he had serious ambitions. He didn't want to just be a movie star, he wanted to be a great actor. He admired actors who were known for their craft and intensity. At the top of that list was Marlon Brando. Brando had revolutionized screen acting with his raw, mumbling, emotionally honest style in films like A Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront. He was the original rebel, the template for the kind of brooding anti-hero that James Dean would later perfect and that Elvis would, in some ways, emulate. Elvis saw Brando as the gold standard, so it's no surprise that a story exists about Elvis seeking out a meeting with his idol. The story goes that in the late 1950s or early 1960s, while working at the Paramount Studio lot, Elvis learned that Brando was also on the lot. And Elvis, who was normally shy around other celebrities he admired, supposedly made an effort to meet him. He wanted to talk to Brando about acting, to get advice, to simply be in the presence of greatness. According to this unconfirmed story, the meeting did happen, but it was a disappointment. Brando was reportedly dismissive and aloof. He saw Elvis not as a fellow artist, but as a pop phenomenon, a musician who was dabbling in acting. He offered no encouragement, no words of wisdom. The meeting was brief and awkward, leaving Elvis feeling let down. This version of the story paints Brando as arrogant and Elvis as a naive fan. There is no firm proof this ever happened. It's a piece of Hollywood lore that has been passed around for decades. What is documented is Elvis's admiration for Brando. He studied Brando's films. In his own dramatic roles like King Creole and Jailhouse Rock, you can see flashes of Brando's style in Elvis's physicality and the way he conveyed emotion. The famous Jailhouse Rock dance sequence, with its stylized movements, has been compared by some critics to the kind of choreography found in musical theater, but Elvis's personal performance has that Brando-esque intensity. The idea of a meeting is plausible. They were two of the biggest stars in the world, often working on the same studio lots. It's easy to imagine their paths crossing, and Brando's rumored reaction is also in character. He was famously mercurial and had a complex relationship with his own fame. He might have resented Elvis's seemingly effortless rise to stardom. If the meeting didn't happen, the story still serves a purpose. It illustrates the central tragedy of Elvis's acting career. He had the raw talent and the desire to be great, but he was never given the chance. He was never paired with a great director or a challenging script. Unlike Brando, who constantly sought out difficult roles, Elvis was packaged into a series of light, profitable musicals by Colonel Tom Parker. A meeting with Brando, whether real or imagined, represents the legitimate acting world that Elvis wanted to be a part of but was always kept just outside of. It's the story of the student being rejected by the master. Did Elvis ever really try to approach Brando, or was he too intimidated? If Brando was dismissive, was it out of arrogance, or did he simply not know how to respond to the phenomenon that was Elvis Presley? And what if the meeting had gone differently? What if Brando had seen the potential in Elvis and taken him under his wing? Could a few words of encouragement from his idol have given Elvis the confidence to fight the Colonel for better roles and change the entire trajectory of his film career? Number 7. Did the Stones pay a visit to the King's Court? The Beatles meeting with Elvis in 1965 is the stuff of legend. It was a summit of the two biggest forces in popular music. But what about the other great British invasion band, the Rolling Stones? The Stones were the dark, dangerous counterparts to the Beatles' more charming image. They were blues purists, swaggering, and rebellious. A meeting between Elvis and the Rolling Stones would have been a fascinating encounter, a meeting between the original rock and roll rebel and his grittier, more cynical descendants. A story has long circulated that such a meeting did occur, but it was far from a friendly summit. The rumor places the event sometime in the mid-1960s, when the Stones were first touring America. They were in Los Angeles, and through some connection, an invitation was extended to visit Elvis at one of his homes. The Stones, curious about the legend, went along. The account of the meeting, as the legend goes, is not a happy one. Elvis was supposedly in his king mode, surrounded by the Memphis Mafia, holding court. He was polite but distant. The Stones, particularly Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, were not impressed. They saw a man who had become a parody of his former self, an establishment figure completely detached from the raw blues and rock and roll that had inspired them. The cultural gap was too wide. The story often ends with the Stones leaving early, feeling disillusioned. Is this story true? It's very difficult to verify. Keith Richards, in his autobiography Life, makes no mention of meeting Elvis, which is a significant omission for a man who remembers almost every detail of his musical journey. He talks at length about his love for early rock and rollers like Chuck Berry and Scotty Moore, Elvis's guitarist, but Elvis the man is absent. Similarly, no one from Elvis's camp has ever corroborated a meeting with the entire band. However, there is a confirmed, but very different, connection. In 1969, Elvis recorded the song Suspicious Minds in Memphis. The song was written by Mark James. At the same studio, American Sound Studio, the Rolling Stones were in town and reportedly dropped by during a session. But they were there to see the studio and the session musicians, not necessarily to meet Elvis, who may not have even been present at that exact moment. This brief professional overlap is a world away from the rumored awkward house party. The myth of the failed meeting persists because it fits a popular narrative. It's the story of the young, authentic rebels confronting the old, bloated king and finding him wanting. It plays into the idea that Elvis had sold out, a common criticism leveled against him in the mid-1960s during his movie years. The Rolling Stones, in this story, act as the judges of rock and roll authenticity, and Elvis fails their test. It's a powerful story, but it's likely an invention, a piece of folklore created to illustrate the changing of the guard in rock music. The reality is that Elvis and the Stones had a huge amount of shared musical DNA. The Stones' early albums are filled with covers of the same blues and R&B artists that Elvis had drawn from. They both revered artists like Arthur Crudup and Jimmy Reed. A real conversation between Keith Richards and Elvis about the blues could have been legendary. Why has this story of a bad meeting become so popular when a real meeting likely never happened? Does it say more about our need to create conflict and drama between our idols than it does about the artists themselves? If Mick Jagger had come face to face with the 1965 version of Elvis, would he have seen a faded star, or would he have recognized the formidable charisma that still captivated millions? And what would Elvis have made of the raw, aggressive energy of the Rolling Stones? Number 6, did the pop art prince try to capture the king? Andy Warhol built his career on the images of American celebrity. Campbell's soup cans, Coca-Cola bottles, and the faces of the famous were his raw materials. He took icons like Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor and turned them into silkscreen prints that were both a celebration and a critique of fame. Given his fascination with celebrity culture, it seems inevitable that he would turn his attention to the biggest star of them all, Elvis Presley. And he did. Warhol's series of Elvis prints showing Elvis as a cowboy from the movie Flaming Star are among his most famous works. The unconfirmed encounter here is not about a social meeting, but a professional one. The story is that Warhol, at the height of his factory fame in the mid-1960s, wanted to do more than just use a publicity still of Elvis. And he wanted to film him. Warhol's screen tests were a famous part of his work. He would point a stationary camera at a subject and film them for several minutes, usually in silence. The result was a raw, unfiltered portrait. He did this with countless artists, musicians, and socialites who passed through his New York studio, The Factory. The rumor is that he wanted to subject Elvis to this same process. The idea of Elvis Presley sitting for a Warhol screen test is mind-boggling. Elvis's public image was one of the most tightly controlled in history. Every photo, every film appearance, every public statement was carefully managed by Colonel Tom Parker. The idea of letting Andy Warhol, the eccentric prince of the New York avant-garde, have uncontrolled access to Elvis with a camera would have been the Colonel's worst nightmare. Warhol's art was about stripping away the veneer of celebrity. The Colonel's job was to maintain that veneer at all costs. There is no evidence that a formal request was ever made. It's more likely that this was an ambition of Warhol's that he expressed to his inner circle. In books about Warhol's life like Popism, the Warhol 60s, he talks about his fascination with Hollywood and its stars. Elvis represented a particular kind of American masculinity and fame that was different from the Hollywood actresses he often depicted. Elvis was a working class hero, a pop idol, and a movie star all at once. For Warhol, he was the ultimate subject. Even without a meeting, the connection between the two men is significant. Warhol's Elvis paintings, created in 1963, helped to cement Elvis's status not just as a pop star, but as a piece of high art. Warhol saw that the image of Elvis was as powerful and as meaningful as any other symbol in American culture. He understood that Elvis had become more than a man. He was a brand, an icon, a piece of living pop art. Though Elvis himself was probably unaware of Warhol's work at the time, his tastes were more traditional. The story of the desired screen test is a perfect what if. What would we have seen if Elvis had sat in front of Warhol's camera for 3 silent minutes? Would we have seen the confident king, the shy boy from Tupelo, the boredom and frustration of a man trapped in a golden cage? It would have been a battle between the most manufactured image in pop culture and an artist whose entire purpose was to deconstruct such images. What would Colonel Parker's reaction have been if Warhol had somehow managed to get a request to him? Did Warhol ever try to use his connections in the art and film worlds to get to Elvis? And if that silent film portrait of Elvis existed today, would it be considered the most revealing document of the man behind the myth, or would Elvis's charisma have been powerful enough to perform even for a silent, static camera? Number 5, did a secret meeting happen with the man who replaced him? Bob Dylan's arrival in the early 1960s was a seismic event in music. He changed the rules. He proved that a pop singer could be a poet, a social critic, and the voice of a generation. His complex literary lyrics stood in stark contrast to the simple "I love you, you love me" pop songs of the era. While Dylan was redefining what a song could be, Elvis was in Hollywood, making movies like Harlem Scarum and Paradise, Hawaiian Style. To many young people, Dylan had become the new standard for authenticity, and Elvis was the old guard. Given this context, the idea of them meeting is fraught with tension. The most persistent rumor about an Elvis-Dylan encounter is not about a planned summit, but a spontaneous, almost accidental meeting. The story goes that in the mid-1960s, Bob Dylan and a few friends were riding motorcycles, possibly near one of Elvis's homes in California. They decided, on a whim, to try to see him. They rode up to the gate and tried to get in, only to be turned away by security. This story has been told by Al Aronowitz, a journalist who was close to Dylan and the Beatles. He claimed to have been there that day. According to Aronowitz, they were just having fun, and the idea of meeting Elvis was a bit of a joke. They didn't really expect to get in. It was more about the gesture, the young gunslingers riding up to the fortress of the old master. Whether this specific event happened or not, the relationship between the two artists is well documented. Elvis was aware of Dylan. He respected him as a songwriter. In 1966, in a surprising move, Elvis recorded Dylan's song, "Tomorrow Is a Long Time." His version is beautiful, heartfelt, and considered by many, including Dylan himself, to be one of the best covers of his work. When Dylan heard it, he reportedly said, "That's the recording I treasure the most." For Elvis to record a Dylan song was a significant artistic statement. It was a nod to the new wave of songwriters and a sign that, despite the frothy movie soundtracks, he was still a serious artist with impeccable taste. Later, Dylan would co-write the song "I Shall Be Released," which Elvis would perform live in the 1970s. And in one of the stranger connections, Dylan attended one of Elvis's shows at Madison Square Garden in 1972. He was just another face in the crowd, watching the man who had first inspired him to pick up a guitar. So while a face-to-face conversation may never have happened, they communicated through music. Elvis's recording of "Tomorrow Is a Long Time" was a message of respect to Dylan. Dylan's attendance at the concert was a message of respect back to Elvis. The rumor of the motorcycle ride at the gate serves as a metaphor for their relationship. Dylan, the outsider, approaches the palace of the king, not in an aggressive way, but with a sense of curiosity and perhaps even reverence. He can't get in, but the connection is still made. If Dylan had managed to get past the gate that day, what would have happened? Could two of the most famously private and guarded men in music have had a real conversation? Would they have talked about songwriting, about the pressures of being the voice of a generation? Or would they have just sat in awkward silence, two myths in a room with nothing to say? And what did Elvis truly think of the man who had so completely changed the job description of a pop star? Number 4, did a solo John Lennon seek out the king? The meeting between Elvis and the Beatles on August 27, 1965, is one of the most documented events in rock history. The four lads from Liverpool went to Elvis's Bel Air home. They were nervous. The meeting was initially awkward. Then Elvis called for some guitars, and they all started jamming together. It was a summit that met expectations, but the unconfirmed story is about a second, much different encounter, this time between Elvis and John Lennon alone. This rumor is set in the 1970s. Both men were in very different places in their lives. Elvis was the king of Las Vegas, but his health and creativity were in decline. John Lennon was a solo artist and a political activist living in New York. He had shed the mop-top image of the Beatles and was now a controversial figure in his own right, under surveillance by the FBI. He was also famously outspoken and cynical. The story suggests that Lennon, during a trip to Las Vegas or Los Angeles, tried to see Elvis again. The motivation is unclear. Was it to reconnect with his childhood hero? Was it to try and talk some sense into a man he saw squandering his talent? Or was it simply morbid curiosity? According to this rumor, the meeting either didn't happen because Elvis refused it, or it was a brief, depressing encounter. The story paints a picture of Lennon seeing the bloated, paranoid version of his idol and leaving disillusioned. There is no credible evidence to support this claim. May Pang, who was Lennon's companion during his Lost Weekend period in the mid-1970s, has never mentioned any such attempt in her detailed accounts of that time. No one from Elvis's camp has ever spoken of a solo visit from Lennon. The original 1965 meeting itself had a complex aftermath. Lennon, who idolized the early rebellious Elvis, was famously disappointed by the man he met. He later made critical remarks, saying Elvis in his Vegas years was a fat old guy in a jumpsuit. Given Lennon's public comments, it's hard to believe Elvis would have been eager for a private meeting. The story likely stems from a desire to create a final, tragic chapter to the Elvis-Beatles relationship. The first meeting was the happy, optimistic beginning. This rumored second meeting is the sad, disillusioning end. It reflects the way many fans of the 1950s Elvis felt about his 1970s incarnation. In this story, Lennon acts as the stand-in for all those disappointed fans. The story also highlights the different paths the two men took after achieving immense fame. Lennon constantly tried to shed his past and reinvent himself both musically and personally. He used his fame as a platform for political activism. Elvis, in contrast, retreated into his fame. He became more isolated, surrounded by the same people, singing many of the same songs. He was trapped by the image he and the Colonel had created. A meeting between the 1970s versions of these two men would have been a meeting between an artist who couldn't stop changing and an artist who couldn't seem to change at all. What could have prompted Lennon to even consider such a meeting, given his later comments? Was there a part of him that still hoped to find the man who had changed his life? If Elvis had agreed to see him, what would Lennon have said? Would he have been confrontational, or would he have shown a compassion for a fellow superstar trapped by fame? Or is the entire story a fiction, created to provide a dramatic final scene for the relationship between rock's two greatest acts? Number 3 were the Beach Boys and the King musical rivals. In the mid-1960s, the two biggest American forces in popular music were Elvis Presley and the Beach Boys. Elvis was the established king, the solo superstar. The Beach Boys were the kings of surf rock, and with Brian Wilson's increasingly sophisticated productions, were becoming major artistic innovators. They were both signed to rival record labels, RCA for Elvis and Capitol for the Beach Boys. It's natural to assume there was a rivalry, but a rumored meeting suggests a moment of mutual respect. The story takes place on a Hollywood soundstage. The Beach Boys were working on their own project, and Elvis was nearby, filming one of his movies. The rumor is that Elvis, hearing the complex harmonies and innovative sounds coming from the Beach Boys studio, walked over to see what was going on. He listened for a while, impressed by the intricate vocal arrangements and the studio wizardry of Brian Wilson. He then paid them a compliment, acknowledging their talent before heading back to his own, much more formulaic movie soundtrack recording. This is a story that has been told in a few different versions. Bruce Johnston, a member of the Beach Boys, has talked about meeting Elvis and the respect he had for the band. He confirmed that Elvis was a fan of their harmonies. The specific story of Elvis walking into their session is harder to pin down. It might be an amalgamation of several brief encounters and expressions of mutual admiration. What is certain is the musical connection. Both Elvis and the Beach Boys relied on the same group of elite Los Angeles session musicians, known as the Wrecking Crew. Their players like guitarist Tommy Tedesco, bassist Carol Kay, and drummer Hal Blaine played on countless hits for both acts. So, while Elvis and the Beach Boys may not have been in the studio together, their sounds were being shaped by the very same people. They were musical cousins, even if they never had a family reunion. The story of the studio visit is powerful because it highlights the artistic crossroads Elvis was at in the mid-1960s. While he was recording songs like Do the Clam, Brian Wilson was creating Pet Sounds, an album that would change popular music forever. The rumor of Elvis listening in on the Beach Boys session is a poignant image. It's the image of a genius recognizing another genius, perhaps with a sense of wistfulness for the artistic freedom the other man had. Elvis was capable of creating complex, beautiful music, but his contractual obligations rarely allowed for it. The story also runs counter to the idea of a bitter rivalry. While their record labels may have been competitors, the artists themselves seemed to have a healthy respect for one another. The Beach Boys, like almost everyone else, were influenced by early Elvis, and Elvis in turn recognized the incredible talent of Brian Wilson and the unique sound of the band. Did Elvis ever actually stand in the doorway of a Beach Boys recording session marveling at their sound? If he did, what was going through his mind? Did he feel a pang of jealousy for their creative freedom? Did he go back to his own movie set and push for better material, only to be shut down by the producers? Or is the story a pleasant fiction, a way of imagining a moment of solidarity between two of America's greatest musical treasures during a time of immense creative change? Number 2, did the Queen of Blues and the King of Rock almost duet? Janis Joplin was a force of nature. Her raw, blues-drenched voice was a sound of pure, unadulterated emotion. She was the queen of psychedelic soul, a symbol of the wild, uninhibited spirit of the late 1960s counterculture. She was, in many ways, the female equivalent of the early Elvis, a white Southerner who channeled the power and pain of the blues into a new, electrifying form of rock and roll. A meeting between these two vocal powerhouses would have been monumental. A rumor persists that such a meeting was once on the verge of happening, and that it might have even involved a musical collaboration. The story is set around 1969 or 1970. Elvis was back on top with his triumphant return to live performing. Janis Joplin was at the height of her fame, a headliner at Woodstock, and one of the most respected singers in the world. The proposed meeting would have taken place in a recording studio, possibly in Los Angeles or Memphis. The idea was for them to record a duet. It's unclear who initiated this idea. Was it a forward-thinking record executive? Was it a mutual desire of the artists themselves? The thought of Elvis's smooth, powerful baritone intertwined with Joplin's raspy, emotional scream is a stunning concept. They could have tackled a classic blues standard or a gospel song, two genres they both loved and excelled at. A duet between them would have been a landmark recording, bridging the gap between the first generation of rock and roll and the Woodstock generation. However, the story goes that the meeting never materialized. The reasons are speculative. Some say the timing was never right. Their busy touring and recording schedules just didn't align. Others suggest that the cultural gap was too wide. Elvis's world was one of professional musicians and a controlled environment. Joplin's world was part of the more chaotic, drug-fueled rock scene of the late 60s. It's possible that their respective management teams, Colonel Parker for Elvis and Albert Grossman for Janis, saw the collaboration as too risky or complicated. There is no hard evidence to support this rumor. Neither Elvis nor Janis ever spoke about it publicly. But the story endures because it feels like it should be true. They were two of the greatest white blues singers of all time. They both understood how to convey deep emotion through their voices. Elvis, in his best moments, could sing with a heart-wrenching vulnerability. Janis Joplin lived in that vulnerable space every time she opened her mouth. The tragedy of the story is amplified by what happened next. Janis Joplin died of a drug overdose in October 1970. Any chance of a collaboration was gone forever. Elvis was reportedly saddened by her death, as he was by the deaths of other young musicians. He understood the dangers and pressures of the lifestyle. The rumor of the duet that never was serves as a poignant reminder of the potential that was lost. Who first floated the idea of this legendary duet? Was it just a fantasy in a record company boardroom, or did it get closer to reality? If they had managed to get into a studio together, what song would they have chosen? Amazing Grace, Summertime? And could a collaboration with an artist as raw and vital as Janis Joplin have inspired Elvis and pulled him out of the creative complacency of his later years, changing the final chapter of his own story? Number 1, did two kings of cool share a stage? Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley were the two dominant male vocalists of the 20th century. Sinatra was the master of phrasing, the king of the crooners, the chairman of the board. And Elvis was the king of rock and roll, the raw, energetic voice of a new generation. In the 1950s, they were seen as rivals, representing a cultural divide. Sinatra famously and short-sightedly called rock and roll the most brutal, ugly, degenerate, vicious form of expression he had ever heard. But things changed. On March 26, 1960, Elvis, just back from the army, appeared on a special episode of Sinatra's television show, the Frank Sinatra Timex Special. The show was titled Welcome Home, Elvis. It was a massive television event. On the show, in a symbolic gesture of peace, Sinatra sang a swinging version of Elvis's Love Me Tender, and Elvis sang a heartfelt version of Sinatra's Witchcraft. Then they sang a medley together. It was a formal, televised meeting of the two kings. This is a confirmed historical fact. The unconfirmed encounter is what happened afterwards. The rumor is that this televised meeting was not just a one-off publicity stunt. Beginning of a genuine, if private, friendship. The story goes that Elvis and Sinatra developed a mutual respect that led to several private meetings over the years, usually in Las Vegas, where both were regular headliners in the 1970s. These weren't public events, but quiet meetings in a hotel suite away from the cameras. According to this story, they would talk about music, about the pressures of fame, and about the business. And Sinatra, the ultimate survivor, supposedly offered advice to Elvis. He saw a younger artist grappling with some of the same demons of isolation and celebrity that he himself had faced. He was concerned about the people surrounding Elvis, particularly Colonel Tom Parker, whom Sinatra and his well-connected friends deeply distrusted. The rumor suggests Sinatra tried to warn Elvis to get him to take more control of his life and career. This story comes from various sources, including some people on the fringes of both men's entourages. It's a story that feels plausible. Both men were the undisputed kings of their domains in Las Vegas. They ran in similar, if not overlapping, circles. It makes sense that they would interact. And Sinatra's daughter, Nancy, has spoken of the affection her father had for Elvis. But the details of these private, serious conversations are impossible to verify. Peter Guralnick's biography mentions Elvis's deep respect for Sinatra, but provides no evidence of a close advisory friendship. The story is compelling because it offers a potential lifeline that Elvis never took. Sinatra had weathered career slumps, personal scandals, and the changing tastes of the public. He had successfully transitioned from a teen idol to a respected artist and actor. He was a master of self-preservation. If anyone could have guided Elvis through the treacherous landscape of his later years, it might have been Sinatra. The idea of these two legends sitting in a Vegas suite late at night, with Sinatra trying to give the younger king the wisdom he needed to survive, is a powerful and tragic image. Did Frank Sinatra really try to intervene in Elvis's life and warn him about the Colonel? If these private meetings happened, what specific advice was given? Was Elvis too proud, too loyal, or too deep in his own world to listen? And if Elvis had taken Sinatra's advice, broken free from his past, and taken control of his own destiny, could the king of rock and roll have survived to become an old man?